In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Dragon Knight build. This is an evolution of the Dragon Priest build and can be played around level 100. So if you want to find out how to play that build around this level, then watch on to find out. Now, when I started working on this build, I was trying to put together a pure Faith caster. People have been asking me for this, how to play only Faith. But what I quickly realized is that Arcane is the way to go if you're trying to play a Faith caster, because the Dragon Communion seal is just too good. Not only does it boost the damage of Dragon spells, but it also has S scaling in Arcane and C scaling in Faith, making it outperform any of the seals that I've tested pretty much at this point in the game. Just going around chucking, fireballs and lightning spears and rocks at things, testing out different seals, the Dragon Communion seal outperforms them when you use Arcane at this level versus Faith at the same level or even slightly more Faith. There's just no comparison. The damage is always slightly higher with the Dragon Communion seal, making you actually play a Faith caster, one that uses incantations, as an Arcane build and still playing in the same style. I didn't set out to make a Knight build when I was working on this build, but I quickly realized that when you have the Jellyfish Shield in your left hand like we do, in order to boost your damage by 20% from all sources, you have a pretty good shield in your left hand, and that means that you need to put the seal in your right hand in order to maintain that buff. So you're sort of halfway there to a tank already. If you put a weapon in your right hand after you buff with Golden Vow, and with that, you have plus 35% increased damage, and that makes for a really good melee opportunity. When you combine that with any sort of weapon that has Arcane scaling, then you do incredible damage. And since you can make any weapon, not any weapon, but a lot of weapons in the game, you can change their Ash of War on them and make their affinity occult, which makes them scale with Arcane be scaling most of the time. You get substantial damage out of your melee weapon for just pumping the stat that you were going to pump for ranged spells anyway. So your damage is incredible at melee. You have a great shield. At that point, it seemed like now you can melee or cast, and I didn't really set out to play it that way, but it just makes sense. Why not be able to do that if you can? Now, when it comes to the weapon that you want to use, it's really up to you. This build is not supposed to be focused around the weapon specifically. So any weapon that has a Occult affinity that you can put a Occult affinity on, or it comes natively with Arcane scaling, is fine. But I picked the Iron Greatsword for mine because in my testing with Bloody Slash, which also increases in damage per point of Arcane, by the way, so if you're using Bloody Slash, you should be playing it on an Arcane build, ideally. It did the most damage on Greatswords and Curved Greatswords. For whatever reason, that weapon class gave the most damage per Bloody Slash. So that's why I went with it. But if you want to get your equip weight down, which you might want to do because your stat spread is kind of difficult to maintain with this build at this point in the game, you could use a lighter weapon like a straight sword, go like a long sword or something, set it to Occult, and you'll have a lot less equip weight. Like you'll be down like 8 or 9 equip load, which is fantastic. You can pull some points out of Endurance, which will kind of free up some points for this crazy stat spread of this build. Bloody Slash also hits like a truck with this build because you'll be buffed with Golden Vow, and because you have so many points into Arcane, it just does incredible damage. So you don't even have to cast sometimes. You can use just Bloody Slash to take out regular enemies if you want, and it's an option there for you as well. When it comes to armor for this build, you can really use any that you want. I recommend using the heaviest you can get away with and still medium roll, but one piece that's absolutely crucial is the Silver Tear Mask, and this is because you need that Arcane from that helmet in order to help alleviate some of your stat spread, and it does reduce your attack power by 5%, but because you have B scaling and Arcane on your weapon anyway, it ends up being like 1% damage reduction for 8 Arcane, which is fantastic. The talismans we use for this build are Radagon's Source Seal, Faithful's Canvas Talisman, and the Curved Sword Talisman. The fourth slot is up to you, and there are really 3 good choices here. The Ritual Sword Talisman will boost your damage total by 10% if you're at max health. If you're using Bloody Slash regularly, this isn't going to benefit you because you actually deal damage to yourself before the Bloody Slash goes off. So even if you're using like a heal over time, this isn't going to benefit you very much if you're using that ability. But if you're not using it, that's a good choice. Otherwise, you're going to either want to use the Fire Scorpion Charm or the Magic Scorpion Charm in order to boost your fire damage or magic damage. You can use either one of these, and you'll probably swap them around depending on the situation. So Radagon's Source Seal is there to alleviate some of the stat problems this build has at level 100. As you approach level 150, this isn't going to be as much of an issue, and you'll probably be able to pull this out of the build in order to increase your protection. And you may even replace this with something that boosts your protection. But right now, it's such a stat-hungry build because you need strength for the shield requirements, you need dexterity for the shield requirements, and having, extra endurance and vigor is always good. So it's just really good for this build. Faithful's Canvas Talisman increases the potency of your incantations by a small percentage, but what's crazy is, in my testing with breath attacks with dragon spells, it actually boosts them by a substantial amount. So if you're using dragon attacks, which you absolutely should with this build, then you'll definitely want to make sure you keep this one equipped. The Curved Sword Talisman is there for block counters. If you're playing more of a caster and you're leaning away from the night side, you can probably swap this out with one of the other charms I mentioned. But you can do block counters with this build because you have a shield, which you should, and you can deal fantastic damage the way you're set up with that. So there's no reason really not to have this. And in that 4th spot, as I mentioned, you'll either want Ritual Sword Talisman if you're not using Bloody Slash to keep your damage, 10% damage to all sources, including spells and melee. As long as you're at full health is probably really, really good there. But the Fire Scorpion Charm you're going to use if you're using like a Gil's Breath, and the Magic one you're going to use if you're using the Magic Damage Breath. That one's going to vary a little bit depending what you're doing. If you don't know which one you're going to use, I would default to the Fire one because you're going to be using Black Flame for this build, and that will buff that spell's damage. There are a total of 9 spells that we use for this build: Golden Vow, Blessing's Boon, Lightning Spear, Flame Grant Me Strength, Black Flame, Stone of Garank, Agil's Flame, Smaragd's Glintstone Breath, and Rotten Breath. Golden Vow is there to boost your damage by all sources by 15% for 90 seconds, as well as increase your defenses. You're going to have light defenses because you have Radagon Sword Steel and one of the Scorpion Charms equipped. So getting all the defense you can is great, and also boosting that damage at the same time. You pretty much want to keep Golden Vow up 100% of the time if possible, or at least when you're fighting. Blessing's Boon is there for a heal over time if you decide to use Bloody Slash, but if you're not using Bloody Slash, you probably don't need this spell. Lightning Spear is there to give you a ranged lightning option. Sometimes enemies are weak to lightning, so this is good to have. Flame Grant Me Strength is there to boost your physical and fire damage. This will boost Black Flame and Agil's Flame, as well as boost Stone of Garank and your melee attacks. It's very, very situational because it only has a 30-second buff. But this is probably something you'd pop before going through a boss fog or facing a difficult enemy, but you probably won't use it too regularly. Black Flame is there to give you a ranged fire option. It's probably one of the best ones out there. It deals fairly good damage with this build, so you want to use this when lightning isn't useful and flame is a better option. Stone of Garank is your physical damage ranged option for something that's maybe resistant to either fire or lightning. And you can chain this spell by mashing R1 over and over, which is great. Agil's Flame is an upgraded version of Dragon Fire, and this thing absolutely hits like a freight train with this build. You can basically just melt bosses with it, especially when you have the Scorpion Charm up, Ritual Sword Talisman, and all your buffs up. It's absolutely devastating, and you're going to want to use this to kill tough enemies that are weak to fire. Smaragd's Glintstone Breath is basically the same thing, but a magic damage version. So it gives you an alternate damage type, and that benefits from the Magic Scorpion Charm instead of the Fire one, so you want to swap that if you're planning on, farming a boss or helping people with bosses. For instance, the Gargoyles are, they're not resistant to magic damage, so magic damage is a really good type against them, so you'll want to use this against them or, enemies that are weak to magic. And just like Agil's Flame, this thing is a boss melter. And lastly, we have Rotten Breath because it's there to set the Scarlet Rot status effect. We're not really using it for the damage as much as that status effect. Maybe there's a fight where you want to set this on a tough boss. You shouldn't need it because the other 2 spells are more devastating, but it's there as a backup in case. So generally how this build plays is that you're going to roam around the landscape or in dungeons. You're going to keep Golden Vow up most of the time if you can. And you're going to keep the buff on your Jellyfish Shield up when you want to attack things. It's only a 30-second buff, so you're going to refresh it right before you go into a group of enemies, and that's going to buff your damage another 20%. So your melee attacks are going to be strong, your block counters are going to be strong. And you're going to fling a Lightning Spear here or there, or a Black Flame spell here. Really just kind of chucking them out sparingly because you don't have a ton of FP with this build, particularly at this level. That's something you'll probably address at later levels. But you're going to be kind of hybriding between melee and ranged spells, not necessarily focusing on only range. If you want to go only range, you're going to need a lot more FP. So keep in mind, if you wanted to make just a total ranged version of this, you would definitely want to increase your FP, maybe drop some vigor for FP in order to be able to fling spells more easily. And then obviously you're going to pop Agil's Flame or Smaragd's Glintstone Breath if there's a tough enemy you need to just melt, or there's a pack of enemies you want to thin out. What I like about this build is you have a lot of tools in your kit. You have a lot of different damage types. You have single target, AoE, melee, ranged. You can basically deal with any threat, and a lot of times things just die. This build slaps so hard. Like, if you go into co-op and you just do help people with bosses with this build, they're going to stand there and think you're hacking. It's so broken. So you have just so many options that you're really going to enjoy playing around with the different options you have. And you can also add other spells to this build, but these are just a few that work really well. The stats I have for this build are 36 Vigor, 20 Mind, 21 Endurance, 15 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 25 Faith, and 50 Arcane. Keep in mind that these stats you're looking at are with Radagon's Source Seal, so you'll want to subtract 5 from what you're seeing on the screen, which will match the numbers I just listed. So Vigor is there because you're going to be in melee range sometimes playing this build, and also because your Dragon Breaths take a long time to cast. There's a real possibility you'll get hit in the middle of them, and you want to live. 20 Mind is pretty much the bare minimum I feel like you can get away with this build and still use everything in your toolkit. Keep in mind that if you do want to play just a pure ranged caster with this sort of setup, you'll definitely want to have this at least 30 or 35, and you might want to drop some points from Vigor to do that. Endurance is at 26. This is the bare minimum I need for the Iron Greatsword, the Jellyfish Shield, and the armor that I'm wearing, but this may vary a little bit for you. Again, you don't want any more endurance here than you absolutely need in order to keep those stat points for other stats at this point of the game. It probably won't matter as much further into the game, but right now you want to keep that as low as you can. 20 Strength is there to meet the requirement of the Jellyfish Shield. We really don't need it for anything else. It does increase the damage of our weapon, but that's not really what we need it for. 17 Dexterity is there to meet the requirements of the Jellyfish Shield. It only needs 14 Dexterity, but my class started with 12, so I got 17. If you have different Dexterity value on your class, this will vary, but because I'm using Radagon's Source Seal, I didn't need to invest any points there, and if you're using this Source Seal, then you won't need to put points there. Intelligence is at 9 because we don't need any, and Faith is at 25, not only to meet the requirements for Golden Vow, but the Dragon Breath spells, the more advanced versions of them, have like 23 Faith requirements. You need about this much anyway in order to use those, so it's a pretty good break point. Keep in mind, too, that the Dragon Communion Seal has C scaling in Faith, so you're going to benefit in terms of spell damage from those points as well, and they're not just wasted to unlock spells. And lastly, I have 50 points in Arcane. I actually have 42 here, but the Silver Tear Mask is giving me 8, so that's pumping it up to 50. Arcane starts to peter off right about this point of the game, so we don't want too many more points in Arcane there. Probably as the game goes on, you're probably increasing this to just boost your damage, but this is a good point to stop because you need points for your other stats, and your stat spread is kind of all over the place. And lastly, one more thing before I wrap up this video, you're going to want to use the Flask of Wondrous Physique with this build, and you're going to want to change the damage type that it buffs in that flask between magic or fire, depending on which breath you're using at the moment. Maybe you're doing a boss that requires is better with magic damage than fire, or maybe you're doing one that's better with fire than magic. You'll want to swap that around before you go into those fights. But the one that you really want for this as well is the Cerulean Hidden Tier. This eliminates your FP cost for 10 seconds of your spells. So if you pop this and buff like your magic damage and reduce your FP cost to 0 for 10 seconds after you've buffed, and then you just hold down Dragon Breath in boss fights, you can absolutely melt bosses within seconds sometimes. Because you don't need any FP and because you can just keep spamming it and the damage is boosted from, like the magic damage one or the fire damage one, it absolutely wrecks bosses, and you'll want to get in the habit of doing that when you need it. That wraps up our Dragon Knight build video. I'm not sure which build I'm going to do next. I'm thinking of updating the Sword Sage build. I'm really looking forward to that. So that's probably where I'll go. But if you have recommendations or if you have suggestions, please leave them in the comments below.